what do I need to do? I know that I'm having these feelings. I'm not as healthy as I need to be, and that's not good for me. It's not good for my family. It's not good for my work. So what do I do?
Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of FrontStage BackStage. I'm your host, Jason Daye. Each and every week, I have the privilege of sitting down with a trusted ministry leader, and we dive into a topic to help you thrive in both life and leadership. We love encouraging pastors and ministry leaders, and I'm very excited about this week's conversation as I will be joined by Bill Simmons. Bill is president and CEO of Hope Rises International and the author of The Way of Interruption. Bill, welcome to FrontStage BackStage.
Hey, Jason, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited about our conversation. Now, Bill, I'm grateful that you have chosen to share about what God has taught you and how the Spirit has shaped you through your own experience of kind of ministry burnout. And I'd love for us to just begin there. Bill, can you share with us what were you sensing? What were you feeling? What were you experiencing that made you understand that you were facing some burnout in ministry?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, right? Because we talk about burnout, and yet I'm sure that there is not any single clinical definition of what that is, or the
Right.
exact moment you are now officially burned out, you've crossed the threshold. And so the question is, how do we navigate through those challenges, which I think are under the category of burnout. And so I think burnout, it looks like exhaustion. And as a leader who's exhausted, then that looks like unhealthy leadership. And I think that's certainly would have been what was true for me. There was a moment I remember I was headed back from Ghana. We have an office there, and meeting with my team and partners. And on the way back, I had the worst thing happen. I'm saying that facetiously. My airplane seat got messed up. And so I remember being on the phone with the airline in the U.S. and I was, my boarding time was going to be in jeopardy. But I knew I was like having this meltdown inside. And I sort of had this out of body experience a little bit where I'm observing myself and I'm thinking, what is this? Is this what a real meltdown looks like? And our nervous breakdown, which is also a thing that doesn't exist, but we talk about. But I just knew that I was not engaging in the moment well. And of course, it wasn't about that moment. It had nothing to do with my airplane seat. It was all the preponderance of things that had been happening and in my life, and how tired I was. And for me, the key part for me was navigating issue of control, and how God worked in that in my life, which we can talk about more. But burnout was this edge of being unhealthy inside myself and meeting the world and situations. But it was also then, the pivotal moment was at least I was able to see it. I knew that this was not the way. I thought to myself, why can't I just get on the airplane? It doesn't matter the seat. Just accept, be content, as Paul says. Why can't I just be content? And I knew it was more than just this moment. And so I began to consult some folks. And I remember there's a dear friend who actually wrote one of the prayers and liturgies in the book. She deals with war trauma victims in Kosovo and Bosnia. And I was sharing with her in a group, and she said, what you're describing sounds like burnout. And that was the first time I had anyone say that or had that word used in my own vocabulary. And I thought, oh, burnout, that's not something leaders go around just saying and bearing, right, with proudly. I really had a brush with burnout, and have to deal with the shame around what does that mean? Does that mean I was not enough? And of course it does. We're never enough. And so that was the pivotal moment for me, was her sort of raising that up, and I thought, oh, I need to pay attention. And then that led to a journey that ultimately a lot of other things happened we can get into. But yeah, that's how it showed up for me, and control was a big part of that.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Bill. So let's lean into a little bit that idea of control. How did control, or lack of control, or desire for more control, whatever it looks, how did that kind of manifest, and how did you recognize that was actually kind of a pivotal piece of what you were experiencing?
Yeah, I certainly don't think I recognized it immediately, but I think for all of our own individual stories, and you know this, all your listeners know this, ministry leaders are in this space where we understand that people's own stories, of course, radically affect how they intersect with any of these things. And so my own story, growing up in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and having some challenges that I faced there that fall under some category of trauma, and people want to use big T's and little T's. I don't know. It doesn't matter to me, but it certainly began to shape sort of the person that I was becoming and how I was protecting myself from things in life. And so that meant that I started to approach my life that way, and that gets more and more unhealthy if you're not aware of it. And I think early in my own journey toward God working in a radical way in my life in these areas was that I needed to understand sort of what was at the root. And I had a wonderful former pastor who also was a therapist, and I had some time with him, and he really helped me uncover sort of the root of this shadow part of my life and my story, and how it showed up as control. And so, control for me was constantly mitigating for the downside, which sounds like what's so bad about that? Well, it means that I ended up undermining often my staff and team. The very people I wanted to empower as executives and leaders were the people that, I wasn't a micromanager. I would just often manage after the fact and change people's minds for them at the end, and that's very disempowering, and that was discouraging to me. I knew it was a problem, but I couldn't really understand the root of it. And as I began to sort of pull the lid off of that and understand, the origin of that, it was certainly a critical point and part of the process for me, so that I was able to then to say, okay, I'm going to navigate through this. Now I understand. Yes, this is true, and that shows up now as control. And so now I need to be in a constant state of yielding, which is also an old sermon, right? Just open hands and releasing things. There's nothing new about that, but sometimes we think we're doing it, and we don't realize that we're not. And it took some people speaking into my life that really helped me to see that. And then that issue of control, which I think for pastors and for parachurch ministry leaders, we often fight this battle with feeling like everything depends on us. And that the ministry and the church, the work, we are the hub of this thing. And my journey through that and through sabbatical was slowly peeling back and saying, none of this depends on me. And I had to learn that the only role that I have that God can't replace is being a husband and a father. And he can replace me in my ministry. So he doesn't need me to be the CEO of Hope Rises International. He wants me. That's the beautiful thing, is to be wanted, to be invited and used then by God. But if I step over that line and then it becomes it hinges on me, then I have to control everything. I mean, if it all hinges on you, of course you have to make sure it all works. And that's exhausting. And so all of that, peeling all of that back, has been the process.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful, Bill. Something that I can't help but notice as you're sharing is other people were instrumental for you. People that you trusted, people that knew you, seemed to be instrumental in speaking into your life and helping you kind of uncover things, maybe see things that you, like you said, you kind of knew it was there, but you didn't, you weren't able to name it necessarily or put your finger on it. Share with us a little bit about kind of that relational aspect and the value of that for a ministry leader.
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. I could not have done it if I hadn't already been on a journey. I think so. That's, sort of the end of the journey is not the beginning. And sort of for me, what felt very radical in the last 3 years, 4 years, it really was an accumulation of things. And so I certainly, I've been invested in, executive coaching for years.
Mm-hmm.
I've done some therapy. I've done whatever the investment in my own development. I had been doing those things along the way, but I always felt like there was something missing. Like there's some part, I always felt like I was blinded to some part of my life. And so, but I had built in, to your point, I had built in some wonderful relationships. I'm a part of an organization, a network called the Accord Network, which is Christian international relief and development organizations from Compassion to World Vision, and it's 140 or so members. And they have a wonderful thing that they've been doing for, I think, 14, 15 years now, which is they do executive retreats. And they're built around the small group, high confidentiality model. Everyone brings in an issue and you interact around that and work through it together. And out of those, having attended many of them, I developed wonderful relationships among people who were co-laboring in this space. And it's those voices that began to be very important as I started to ask this question of what do I need to do? I know that I'm having these feelings. I'm not as healthy as I need to be. And that's not good for me. It's not good for my family. It's not good for my work. So what do I do? And I did. So then those people were there. They didn't just appear right on the scene right at the end, as they had been cultivated. And this is where I would say that, well, it's one thing to have your friends then sort of help you say, hey, maybe you consider taking a break or taking a sabbatical. But then do you have the support around you to actually make that happen? And I think that's the other area where I'm extremely blessed. I have a wonderful board governance system. And so when I went to my board and I said, I think, I need to take a 3-month sabbatical. And there was no pause. There's no beat or, hey, we should talk or discuss about this. It's absolutely, what do you need? What support do you need? We'll make this happen. And I think that was just as critical. So friends and relationships are critical, but for leaders that are listening, to have a board that is supportive is just as important. And I know next week I'm going to Dallas to be a part of the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, ECFA. They're sort of launching at the Christian Leadership Alliance their new standards of leader care, and this all aimed at what does it mean to support for boards and elder boards to support leaders. To help them be healthy emotionally, spiritually, physically. All of these things are so important. And I think, I couldn't have done it without every single one of those things, with good friends around me, without a good board, a good system. All of that facilitated, how God was then able to use all of that to work in my life. Yeah, I'm sure he could have done it without it. But boy, it's essential if you want to reach into a place of pause and recovery and restoration. You need those support systems around you. And I'm very blessed to have that.
Hey friends, just a quick reminder that we provide a free toolkit that complements today's conversation. You can find this for this episode and every episode at pastorserve.org/network. In the toolkit, you'll find a number of resources, including our Ministry Leaders Growth Guide. This growth guide includes insights pulled from today's conversation, as well as reflection questions, so you and the ministry team at your local church can dig more deeply into this topic and see how it relates to your specific ministry context. Again, you can find it at pastorserve.org/network. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that, Bill. As you were sharing there, I began to think, man, that's incredible. It's awesome that you've cultivated some of those relationships, some of those personal friendships, some of those kind of peer colleague type relationships, and then the blessing of, like you said, the support of your board. Bill, what would you say to a pastor or a ministry leader who feels like they're in a space where, burnout is they're on the edge of burnout, but they do not feel they have a strong support structure around them, or maybe they're even maybe fearful of approaching their, whether it's their elder board at their local church or their, board of directors, and saying, hey, listen, I'm on the edge here. I'd love to pull back and have a sabbatical. What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I guess there's two answers to that question. One is the sort of the tough love question, or way to respond, which is if your board is not like that, then you might need to pray more about what sort of board you may want to work for. That's a harder decision, and sort of have to be pretty daring. So I'm not naive to think that everyone's just going to take that on. But I do think that if a board, I do have to question what a board is doing if they're not thinking through and discerning about how to care for their leader. I would have real concerns about that board, but maybe that's the situation you're in. You can't change that overnight. So what do you do? Which is the other side of the equation. There are resources, and not maybe some of them are free. I'm not aware of free ones, but certainly affordable. There are organizations out there that provide this sort of counseling, spiritual direction, can help you think about sabbatical or ways to build in even just Sabbath into your rhythm. And you don't have to have 3 months off. How does Sabbath become a practice? And there are groups like Soul Care. I think Mindy Calaguar has been on here, I think, with you. She's on my board. Mindy's great. Her organization is wonderful. There's a Coracle, which is out of the DC area. They're also similar spiritual formation direction, soul care minded people, and I'm sure there's plenty of others. But that's my point is that there are resources out there, and I think your all's organization is the same, right? Pastor Serve does the same thing. So there are plenty of resources out here that people can lean in, and I would just say, ask for the resource. Go find someone who can help you walk through. Don't wait. If you're feeling these things, and people are feeling these things. I did a survey of 60 CEOs in a room at a breakfast last October, and asked. It was a Survey Monkey online, live in the room, and asked them on a scale of 1 to 10 where they were in burnout, and 10 being I'm burned out. And that room of 60 people was at 8.5 out of 10.
Wow, right.
And that's pretty staggering. And I know it's the same in the general pastoral space, and ECFA and others have done these surveys, and 80-90% of pastors are feeling burned out. And so I think we can also deal with the symptoms, which is what we're talking about. What do I do if I'm feeling this way? I think we also have to ask some of the causality questions, and what is leading to a pastor being burned out, or to a parachurch ministry leader burned out? And I do not have any empirical evidence. My book alludes to something I feel is a drag coefficient on parachurch ministry leaders, and I've come to believe there's the opposite drag on pastors, and that is, I think that we when we're called to operate out of our vocation, and yet we're implicitly expected to operate there, we are going to not function well. And so the reality is that I think pastors and churches, Eugene Peterson's book called The Pastor, I think he talks about this. He talks about how he loved teaching and preaching, but he hated running the church. And that's because his vocation is not administration, right? And being an executive, he's called to teach and to preach. And yet we expect him to do both. And the inverse for parachurch ministry leaders, we are vocationally called to be executives of organizations, run a great organization that supports the work of the church. And yet we're implicitly expected to somehow be great inspirational visionaries spiritually, do spiritual formation in our organizations, and have this expectation to do that. And it's draining.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's bigger than that. I'm sure there are other things people can do great sociological research probably to add to this. But I know from my own experience and from talking to other CEOs and other pastors that there feels like there's something at least true in that. It may not be all of the truth, but certainly that's part of it. And so, my journey to writing a book was also journeying through, how do I lean into being a Christ-formed organization without taking on the mantle of being a pastor and taking on the role of spiritual formation, which is not what God has called me to do? And how do we balance that? And so that I can have a healthy relationship with it and not feel like, man, I'm failing this. I'm not motivated to do this. And that's a drain when you show up that way.
Right. Absolutely, Bill. I think that's very insightful. And I think that that what you've observed, both at parachurch and within pastoral ministry, I think is right on. That sense of responsibility and expectation to kind of fill some roles that we're not really wired or to fill. So that definitely weighs upon us. Now, Bill, let's shift. So we've talked about the burnout. We've talked about the feeling, the experience, all that. But help us understand, Bill, what did you experience during your sabbatical that was really, kind of some of the aha moments that have now, transformed your life coming through that, that you share a lot of this in The Way of Interruption, your book, that others can kind of consider and embrace and maybe avoid, getting to the brink of burnout.
Yeah, I think you're probably familiar with Abraham Heschel, and his book is called Sabbath. But I think if people haven't read that book, I would highly encourage it because he really gives us access to sort of God's heart and soul behind the gift of Sabbath. And so a sabbatical is just a protracted Sabbath. And I think I hear often people say, well, I took a sabbatical and I went and wrote a book. And I thought, well, that does not sound like a sabbatical. That is not sabbatical. And so, I really tried to lean into, I knew, well, I'll preface it by saying, I knew being a highly control oriented person, I wanted to have everything planned, oriented, that the danger, the risk that I ran in going on a sabbatical was that I would just plan the thing to death and become the CEO of a sabbatical and not, and not actually stop doing anything. And so I had just a couple of sort of big things I put on the calendar, but in general, I wanted to live into Leviticus 25. And this is also in Exodus, but, God says, after 6 years, in the seventh year, the land should lie fallow, and you don't get to do anything with it. And neither does your livestock and your servants, and no one gets to do anything. And I have to think about, what in the world would an agricultural and agrarian society, what are people doing if they can't plow, they can't sow, they can't reap, they're doing nothing, because that's the call, is to do nothing. And so I had to think, well, what does that mean for me to actually let the land lie fallow? Because that is not how I want to be. And so I tried to live into that. That was my whole goal. So my entire 3 month sabbatical, I never once prayed about my organization or role. I never asked God for a new vision. I never thought about all the things I should be doing. I also never inversely, created internal plans where I'm going to do, these 12 things, and that's how I'm going to know I had a successful sabbatical. And that's exactly not the point. There's no score, outcome, impact measure that you can put on a sabbatical. The point is to release yourself, release the land of your life to God, and let Him do what He wills. And I think that's the issue we have with Sabbath in general. I think we don't appreciate what is it that God will do in us if we actually pause and rest and cease from doing things, which is what I love love that. The Hebrew for, sabbatical or Sabbath is Shabbat, which means cease. It doesn't mean rest. Rest may be something God does in us, but if rest is the aim of Sabbath, then we're going to try to generate something that's going to create rest as some outcome. And I think that if we just start with the whole purpose of what God did on the seventh day, which is He ceased, can we do that? And so that was my aim in my sabbatical, and my encouragement to other leaders has been, who have since taken sabbaticals, is do everything you can not to overplan this, and to just be able to be present to your family, your loved ones, to the moment, whatever that is, and let God figure out the rest. And the miracle for me was, as I said, and it does feel like a miracle. The closest thing I've had to a miracle in the last few years is after my sabbatical, 2 days after my sabbatical, God gave me a very clear vision for my organization. And I had never once spent a moment thinking about it, which is how I knew it was like God had been nurturing this little plant all during my sabbatical. Right. And I had spent no time trying to think about what is God calling us back to or toward, none. And so it really was this amazing moment, because I thought, God did all of this because it's never been about me. And so it was this wonderful reminder of that. If I just rest in Him, if I just cease and allow myself to be with Him and trust Him, He'll show up with what I need when I need it. And that was true. And so it was terrifying. And I've sat down with leaders who are terrified of the idea of going somewhere and being quiet for 2 days or 3 days. And I get that, and I've had to learn how to be alone. I mean, that is a hard thing to learn in today's world, how to just be alone with ourselves. And I think sabbaticals are probably healthier if you can be on a journey of learning how to be alone. And so in other words, there's not one thing that God did and that He healed me of all of this in my sabbatical in this moment. It was in the releasing of myself. And then since then, and during and since, then all of the patterns and the practices that God instilled into my life, I've had to exert zero energy in trying to maintain them. They have just become the way that I live, and I look forward to them. And that feels very foreign to me as someone who spent most of their life and faith journey striving after the next, quiet time model I'm going to practice next year, or find the next resource that's going to really unlock, and all of a sudden I find myself in these rhythms and ways, and it's like God is sustaining me and doing it, and then I haven't had to exert energy. Sorry, that was a long response to your question, but I found so much healing in that release that I feel a lot about it.
At Pastor Serve, we love walking alongside of pastors and ministry leaders just like you. If you want to learn more about how you can qualify for a complimentary coaching session with one of our trusted ministry coaches, please visit pastorserve.org/free session. You don't want to miss out on this opportunity? That's pastorserve.org/free session. Yeah, I love that, Bill. That's beautiful. And so let's lean into the rhythms a little bit that you experience. And that's, in the Way of Interruption, you kind of lay this out and you kind of help us understand, these rhythms and what this looks like. So share with us, what is it that you discovered and that is now sustaining you in such a way?
Yeah, I think this is where the simplicity of what I propose is I have to fight my own shame about. I'm really just saying something that's the most simple thing anyone could ever say. And so I'll use a lot more ancient, well-respected people in the book to sort of back me up on this, whether that's Calvin or Luther or Augustine. I think, what I'm trying to capture are things that release us from the constant need or desire to reinvent the wheel. And that just means doing what the church has always done. And I think, and G.K. Chesterton in his book Orthodoxy, he talks about, going off in search of everything, and then he finally comes back and he plants the flag, and he only discovers he's back where he's back home and at a land that's already been discovered. Or he says somewhere else that, he spent his whole life trying to conjure this faith and practice, and he later just realized he could have learned it all in his catechism. And I think we all spend this and especially in the modern world, we have this incessant desire to invent and create. And so again, yielding up control was for me was to just do what the church has been doing for several thousand years and taking the best of that. And so the practices, the first one is more of a, I wouldn't call it, maybe it's a contemplative practice. I haven't thought about it that way until this moment. But it wouldn't sound like that. And that is, in our hurried world, I'm simply encouraging people to take a minute and pause before whatever the rhythm is of your life. In our case, as an organization, the rhythm is meetings. They're all day long, meeting after meeting. And so can we put in front of all of those a consistent interruption, and interrupting the workflow to allow ourselves to reorient ourselves to God and to allow God to re-enter that space, which then might shape our space and our work to be more like Him. But we don't have a particular formative outcome that we're looking for. It's just an orientation. And so pausing, as I've talked to leaders about this, has been one of the more challenging things. Really, has been people saying, you really just stop and you have a minute, 2, 3 minutes of quiet and silence. And I said, yeah, we really do. And that sounds the most foreign. Reading a psalm does not sound as foreign as being quiet for a minute to 2, maybe 3. I dare people to take 3. It's a good number, 3, right? So take 3 minutes and see how weird that feels. But I do think Jesus modeled this. He was never in a hurry, and people always wished he was somewhere faster than he was. If he'd just been there, Lazarus, wouldn't have been in that position. If he could have gotten to Jairus' daughter faster. He's constantly trying to get the disciples away in a boat to give them pause and a break and breathing room. And so, and when he does this with Pilate, in the Holy Week last week, we're reminded of his ability to be silent and not say anything when he's questioned by the high priest or by Pilate. And this is someone who understands how to pause and breathe and take a second and is not hurried. And so if Jesus can do that, then what can we learn from that as a way of being in a world that continues to push us faster and faster, and technology is pushing and is crushed all the limits of space. You can't get up and take a coffee break anymore. These things all have disappeared. And so pausing is the one that I think opens the space for spiritual practice. It's the hardest one. It's a more way of being. But I give this example, this real world story of how important developing it is. Any of these things as practices is, because if we think, oh, these are things we know how to do, we're going to pull those tools out of our box when an event shows up. Well, that's just not the real world. If you've never used, a lathe before, having one in your garage doesn't help you when you need a lathe. If you've never used it, it doesn't matter. And so we had a staff person who said he wanted to consider offering his resignation, as he felt like that was maybe best for us in the organization, which is this is a generous, mature person saying this. I think that's a gift. And so I said, well, we'll need to think about this. So he went away. And the first thing we did was we sat in silence with this for 4 or 5 minutes, allowing people to process this surprise and sit in it and not rush to words, not rush to judgment, not rush to action. Let's sit with it. And then we actually reached for the book and we prayed the prayer for discernment that's in the book. We prayed it together. And then we began to slowly discuss this potential staff departure. We would not have done that 3 years ago. We would not have gone there, and we wouldn't have created that space. But the pause and having it as a practice is why it then gives us that immediate ability then in those moments to show up to it. Everyone talks about, if you're in an argument with your spouse, take 6 deep breaths. Well, if you never take 6 deep breaths, you're not going to do that when you're in an argument with your spouse. Maybe you should try taking 6 deep breaths, 4 or 5 times a day together with your spouse when you're not in a heated moment. So when you are, you might go back to it. And I know that sounds simple, but I think I don't want to miss it. And so
Right.
the the book is about interrupting, and pause is an interruption. And so everything starts there, and whatever comes after it in your organization, we include the ancient rhythm of reading a part of a psalm together as a way for God to invade our space. It's also a very ecumenical space to be in a multi-denominational parachurch ministry. And then we pray, whatever that means, whether that's letting the psalm be the prayer or praying back part of the psalm. And then go about our work. It doesn't take long, 2 to 5 minutes before every meeting. We interrupt ourselves and remind ourselves, and that has proven very, very helpful. So, it works individually, it works in organizations, but it means that no longer is Bill Simmons coming up with the ministry theme of the month, and I'm going to prepare some sort of a message and I'm going to talk about it. I actually just don't do that anymore. I let God speak. I let him speak through his word, and I leave that up to him. And if it's sort of me saying, if he's not enough, then that's just how it's going to be. And that is hard for a leader to say. We like to fill the dead air, and sometimes we feel like God's dead air, and I think that's just not true.
Yeah, that's so good. And we do have that tendency, just thinking as you were talking about the pause, and challenging people to, 1 minute, 2 minute. Yeah, but shoot for 3 minutes, maybe. And just the awkwardness oftentimes, because we live in a world where we're, like you said, accustomed to filling the empty space, right? And we feel like go, but just pulling back and just that alone and allowing that to become a part of who we are and our culture as a organization. There's so much value in that. And it kind of resets us, it's almost like a reboot every time, over and over and over again. And that becomes, not just a habit, it becomes who we are, and the value of that. That's awesome, Bill. Yeah. As we're winding down our conversation, you have the eyes and ears of pastors and ministry leaders who are all serving, on the front lines. What encouragement would you like to leave with them?
Maybe a question that leads to encouragement. I'll tell you where I've been challenged most recently, and I think this will be particularly for parachurch ministry leaders, but it's because it's for parachurch ministry leaders. It's also for pastors, because without the church, there is no parachurch. I think there shouldn't be. Before the Reformation, there was no such thing as a parachurch ministry, and really before 1800, they didn't exist. And so parachurch ministries are new. I have this conversation with people often, that we're still understanding what does it mean to be a Christian organization doing a work in the world, where our theological birth is out of Acts 6 in the birth of the deacons. And so, how do we work and support the church? And I think that's its own question. And some great theologians should continue to think about this. I don't think we think about it enough. We just suddenly have 60,000 Christian nonprofit organizations in the United States. And the question is, are they all actually supporting the church, or are we out over our skis or not? I think these are good questions. And the reason I think it's important, and I think this is a great area for pastors and parachurch ministries to have dialogue, is that I think that what we have missed in our concern for individuals and people on our staffs is we've missed that in a parachurch ministry organization, almost always we have lack of reciprocity. And so that means for me as the CEO, because I sign the paychecks of all my staff, even though we may all be co-laborers in Christ, there is an inequality there. And so if the CEO says, we're going to read this book, we're going to read this book. And if we're going to have this practice, we're going to have this practice. And people can't, they can opt out, but it means they're going to lose their job and they're going to go somewhere else. That's how you opt out. Where in the church, if people don't want to do the Bible study on Wednesday, they don't have to go. If they don't like the sermon topic, if the pastor's daring enough to put it out in advance, they don't show up. People, we have the ability to opt in and out of in our spiritual lives of practice. of different things, or we can obviously, you could leave your church if you really disagreed with something, and that's a lot more difficult in parachurch ministries. And so I think we've not talked about that, and so I think I want to encourage this discourse around how do we really honor individuals, especially in parachurch ministries. I would encourage leaders to think about, are we really giving people an invitation, or is it an expectation? Because I think that's a real challenge. Otherwise, it moves into an area of coercion. And I think that we don't want to say that. We don't want to say that. Could that really be true? It's because it's a very soft coercion. But everyone I've ever told to read a book in my organization has read the book. That's and now I don't recommend. I mean, I don't say, hey, we're going to read this book together. The last time I did that, I really felt convicted after it. I thought that I just shouldn't have done that. Or I could have instead say, here's a book. What do you all think? What do you think about reading this together? And then have everyone opt in or out. And then can I express no judgment on those who said, I'm not interested. I don't want this. Will I diminish their participation, or, whatever? I mean, it's hard. It is definitely hard. And so what I would love to see is more pastors really concerned about how connected parachurch ministries are to their work in the world. And I would love to encourage parachurch ministry leaders to think about, how connected are we to the church? And I mean the organized church, not just the global body of Christ at work. But how are we in fact supporting and relieving? Because that was the whole point. The apostles, they needed to be relieved from this particular work. And so are we in fact relieving and assisting the church in that way? And can we tell that story? And I have a lot of passion and concern about that, and hope that pastors and parachurch ministry leaders will create dialogue around that. Because I think that's where the encouragement can be, is can we see us continue to be more and more of one single thing? And people don't think about Compassion International as this other thing that exists apart from the church, even though they work through the church around the world. But in the U.S., I don't know that how we think about that. Can we do that and create an environment where leaders, especially in parachurch ministries, reach into a much more epistemic humility, a place where we're much more willing to say, you don't have to do this my way, because I'm not your pastor, I'm not your priest, and so I'm going to give you the option. And that is, again, for a leader, it's a difficult space, because I'm not Apple. I mean, Apple, they can say, this is how it's going to be, these are our values, you're going to do it this way. And we're in a weird space, because we're neither the church nor are we truly a corporation. And so how do we balance that? I think we have the toughest job in the world in some ways, to balance something no one else is balancing. So I don't know if that's encouraging, but sometimes I found it be encouraging for someone to give voice to some tension or something that is happening, and say, I feel that, and that's true. And can we navigate it together?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Definitely something to wrestle through, and something to dialogue around, to see and to discern together. You know what I mean? Not just discern in our own silos, discern together how this can be. Bill, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you with us here on the show. The Way of Interruption, incredible book. With what I loved about the book is it's not just some ideas and some theories. It's practices, and then a ton of resources within the book that you can actually implement. You know what I mean? It's like you don't have to take this book and then go find other things. It's like you've packed a ton of liturgy, prayers, different things within the book, to make it very, very accessible and very easy for a ministry leader to lean into this and to begin to develop that sort of a culture. So thank you for that. For those of you watching and listening, there will be links to Bill's book, to Bill's ministry as well, Hope Rises International, and Ministry Leaders Growth Guide, which provides insights and questions to help you and your team at your local church dig more deeply into this conversation that we just had. You can find that at pastorserve.org/network. So please be sure to check that out. Bill, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for making time to hang out with us here on Front Stage Backstage.
All right. Thanks, Jason. It's been great to be here.
All right. God bless you.
You too.
Here at Pastor Serve, we hope you're truly finding value through these episodes of Front Stage Backstage. If so, please consider leaving a review for us on your favorite podcast platform. These reviews help other ministry leaders and pastors just like you find the show so they can benefit as well. Also consider sharing this episode with a colleague or other ministry friend. And don't forget our free toolkit, which is available at pastorserve.org/network. This is Jason Daye, encouraging you to love well, live well, and lead well.